Annie Oakley was well known for being a female role model during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She became a Western icon during her years of show business with her husband, Frank Butler. Annie managed to break the barrier and obtain an occupation within the male-dominated world. At a time when the United States was fighting to make an impression on the world, Annie helped shape many American ideologies today. Annie Oakley's birth name was Phoebe Ann Moses. She was born in Darke County, Ohio on August 13, 1860 and died November 3, 1926. She came from a Quaker background and her family was poor. Her father died of pneumonia when she was at the early age of 6 years old. Annie was sent to the county poor farm to work for another family as a servant whom were abusive. Upon Annie's return, she discovered that her mother and family had been through rough times. Her mother remarried for the third time. However, the family was on the verge of losing the farm. Annie helped with finances by hunting game and selling it in northern Ohio. She was eventually able to pay off the mortgage owed. Her hunting skills made a name for her as a local marksman. She was known to be able to kill the game without spoiling the meat with bullets, which takes a considerable amount of accuracy. Frank Butler was a touring, well-known marksman who often offered competitions with local marksmen. Annie won against Frank, hitting all 25 targets. After the loss, Frank began to actually court Annie, which resulted in marriage on August 23, 1876. Annie and Frank began to appear in shows together while touring, doing shooting demonstrations. Their first show together was on May 1, 1882. Annie started out as an assistant to Frank, holding objects while he would shoot them. During a performance in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1884, Annie became friends with Sitting Bull, a victor at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Sitting Bull gave Annie the nickname Little Sure Shot. In 1885, Annie and Frank joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West. It was during this time that Annie became famous and Frank took a place as her assistant and manager. She became the star of the Wild West shows with posters reading Champion Markswoman, and she also showcased the name Little Sure Shot. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show toured Europe, including shows for Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria was a famous but unlikely fan of Annie's, considering the fact that she was a very conservative queen. Annie Oakley represented the tension between Victorian traditions and progressive women of the time. Annie Oakley found a way to stretch the norm of being a woman in the spotlight while being a modest petite female. She was known not only for her shooting skills, but for her modest wardrobe and mannerisms on stage. She demonstrated that shooting was not harmful or too intense for women. The show became known for showcasing the American character and image of the West. Buffalo Bill also targeted an audience that included women as well. He became very good friends with Annie and Frank until his death in 1917. Annie spoke at his funeral about his passing, as well as the passing of the Wild West era. In 1913, Frank and Annie retired from doing shows in the arena. They settled down on a property in Cambridge, where she started to write her autobiography called Powders I Have Used, which was published in 1914. She continued to write different articles to magazines to encourage women to shoot for self-defense as well as hunt for sport. During World War I, Annie began to offer to train women to shoot for war. Her offer was turned down and she began to raise money for the Red Cross. She toured training camps and gave shooting demonstrations to troops. In 1925, Annie and Frank were in poor health and decided to settle in Darke, Ohio, where she was originally from. Annie died the following year. Annie Oakley's mannerisms were significant on stage, and she had a major impact on popular beliefs about the Wild West. Even though she toured Europe for a significant length of her career, the majority of those who were fans were Americans. She inserted herself into what was considered a man's job, a marksman. She encouraged other women to take up the sport, which was considered too dangerous for them. Annie was 5 foot tall and a slender woman. Even while performing, she still remained what was considered ladylike at the point in time. Her femininity was showcased in order to counterbalance the violence of the show and to appeal to a broader audience. Annie was featured in the International Honor Quilt by Robin Fisher. She helped pave the way for many Wild West ideologies that carry into American culture for women today. On the honor quilt, stars appeared due to the fact that Annie Oakley always featured stars on her hat while performing. Even as a marksman, Annie also enjoyed what was considered more traditional roles in the Victorian era. The IHQ honored Annie with embroidery quilting to signify Annie's love of sewing and embroidering, reading the Bible, and being a wife to her husband, Frank Butler. Robin Fisher regards Annie as a young woman's hero.